From the moment he was born, I've always loved my son, Christian. For the last 6 years, it's just been him and I, a dynamic duo. His mother left us. Not willingly, that is. She passed away on the operating table after a difficult birth. It's sad, but this is more common than people think. However, no matter how much you hear that, you never expect it to happen to you. One of those eerie statistics that people rattle, which you don't think about until it hits you in the face. It was odd. When she died, she was serene, right until the end. She was fixated on making sure our son was born with no complications. It was almost like she knew it would happen. She accepted all her responsibilities and pushed through until the bitter end. She was graceful in death as she was in life. I miss her. Since then, I knuckled down. I had the responsibility of raising my son and maintaining the household all by myself. My family helped at times, but I couldn't expect them to fill any parental roles, so almost all responsibilities fell on me. I always did them though, not just for him, but for her. I tried my best. I worked so hard to raise my son to be the perfect child. I gave him everything I could, whilst never spoiling him. I taught him good values, and tried to align his moral compass in the right direction. He was an angel, as was the feedback all the teachers gave while he grew up. This is why it was a shock to me when he started acting up not long after his 6th birthday. I racked my brain, trying to figure out what went wrong. I questioned if it was the kids he was hanging out with, or maybe an inadequate teacher. Either way, it was becoming more and more frequent that I was being called to listen to complaints from his teacher. The feedback was mind-blowing. I heard of things I could never imagine my son doing in a million years. There were reports from his teacher that he would hit other kids, not sharing books and class equipment, and even name-calling. These were things I fervently taught him not to do, which saddened the teacher as he had to confirm what they were saying was true. I left in shock. I was in a heavy-set denial about the whole thing. These were all behaviours he had never had any problem with before, and were things I always made sure to spend time teaching him not to do. I felt that none of this was my fault, and if they were true, it had to have originated somewhere else. When I took him home, I lectured him in a roundabout way. As I'd explained things that were wrong to do, it was the sweetest thing. He'd listen with an attentive smile, agreeing with every point I made. Making others feel bad is not good. Make sure to help out others who need help. Always be kind, and people will be kind to you in return. He said he'd do what he was told, and I was confident he'd be fine. But he never was. No matter how much I drilled good values into him, I'd be pulled aside every so often and told of the heinous things he'd done in school. I was sickened by some of the stories told, but every time I'd come back to Christian, he was the nicest kid in the whole world. Either they were lying to me, or he was only good when I was around. One factor was eliminated when his main teacher left. I felt that if the problem was him, this would be his fresh start with someone who cared. But they never did. They only got worse. I was called in to look over his art from class. Without getting into too much gruesome detail, they were disturbing. I don't know how a child conveyed such dark emotions with such simple abstract pictures, but he did. This wasn't a one-off either. It became so frequent that to save both the teachers and my time, he just saved them up and we'd review them at the end of the week. Each picture was unique in its own sense, conveying a pain that I never knew someone so young could simulate. I would try bring this up with Christian, subtly at first, then progressively more on the nose, until I was confronting him about it. Each time, he'd have a passable reason for everything. The drawings were often obscure, with the darker details being seen through the lens of artistic interpretation. In other words, he claimed they were the simple shapes and colours that lay on the page, not the twisted amalgamations of pain and suffering that could be compared to Dali crossed with Picasso. The art was easier to explain than the behaviour. With each meeting, I would be told about the various forms of acting out Christian did. He hit other kids when the teacher wasn't looking. He would pull on girls' hair, spit at people he didn't like. He was never seen by an adult, but the frequency of these complaints from the other students made it more and more believable. This all culminated to the teacher confronting me earlier than our weekly meeting. He informed me that my son, for the first time, drew blood. Usually, his demeanour was calm. However, that day, the teacher was frantically ranting at me. In his exasperated tone, he told me my son had bitten another kid, drew blood, and alluded that he tried drinking it. He went on to call him a demon and he should be burned, let alone expelled. I was shocked, and it told me one very important thing. He hated my son. This explained everything. How his art had a much higher degree of talent than a 6-year-old should be able to produce, that it seemed like the evidence was planted. How his behaviour was never reported by any other teachers and only came from these unverified complaints from other students, and how the other kids still seemed to talk to my son like nothing was wrong. This got heated to the point that the head teacher had to get involved. We both explained our sides and left it to her to make a decision. Either my child really was a demon who was somehow gaslighting the teacher with comic book villain level torment, or my son was being victimized by an inadequate teacher. She went off to contemplate action, and for a while it was left at that. During my next meeting, in which I heard some more egregious actions my son supposedly did, which I didn't pay much mind to anymore, the headmaster came to an agreement. My son would see a behaviour specialist. She told us she found someone who could pick up on a child's behavioural patterns just from a simple conversation, and that if my son was lying, he'd know. To me, this was perfect. A third-party opinion that could almost guarantee the truth. I was confident, to say the least. I agreed in a heartbeat. I told Christian about it, preparing him the same way any parent prepares their kid for the dentist or a test. I told him of the importance to be good, but to also be himself and relax. Normally, he was on board with whatever needed to be done. However, this time, he was against it. He argued that he had a bad feeling, but I assured him that everything would be fine, and sadly, we couldn't refuse. It was necessary. Though Christian wasn't happy, he eventually relented, but not before voicing his disdain towards me. I just accepted it as that kid hate that parents get when they don't get their way. Christian went into the meeting. It was scheduled to be an hour, but only 15 minutes later, he popped out ready to leave. A smug smile plastered across his face. Christian was itching to go, but I was called in to see the psychiatrist to Christian's protests. The psychiatrist sat me down and got straight to the point. He looked frazzled, like he had aged years since I saw him only minutes ago. He muttered out that he was special. I was shocked at this. I started to defend his odd behaviours and that he shouldn't be put into special needs, but he reiterated what he meant. He meant special. I was confused at this, a confusion which was never answered as he moved forward. He told me Christian is not normal and never will be. Not only that, things will only get worse. However, he was willing to take him off my hands and my loss would be heavily compensated. He ended that this would be for his own good. I was stunned at this egregious offer. I was horrified that another human being would even think to make this kind of statement, let alone a professional. What made it worse was that he put it forward like he was doing me a favour. I promptly told him where he could stick it and stormed out. On the way out, he tried to hand me his business card, which I ignored as I walked away. I grabbed my son and promptly left. After all this, I felt bad for Christian. I decided I would treat him on the way home to some ice cream. Even eating his favourite dessert, he was still mad about everything. And he hadn't even heard what I heard. I couldn't imagine how he felt in that moment. I tried to ask him how it went. However, at the smallest start to conversation, he went off on me. He accused me multiple times of being with them. I tried to ask who they were, but he said that I knew. I told him I wasn't with anyone, that I would always be there for him. He called me a liar. I couldn't help but nervously eat my ice cream, trying to think of a way to calm him. While lost in thought, Christian uttered one last statement with a tone of finality: to never give him to them. As he did so, a horrible taste overcame my senses. I spat out my ice cream immediately, continuing to spit more after to try wash away the taste. What I put in my mouth was chocolate ice cream. What came out was something that could only be described as looking like chocolate ice cream. My heart started racing. This was the first moment where I started questioning if I was wrong about my son. But after that stunt, I knew to keep my mouth shut and not say anything out of line. I simply asked if he did that, and in a smug tone, he said no. After leaving the store with a hefty gift card as compensation for our inconvenience, to the confusion of the staff members, we went home. From then on, I was more conscious of his behaviour. I started picking up on behaviours that were always there, but never stood out until then. He was acutely aware for his age, more than he should be. While out, he would always be looking around, studying people in the distance. Sometimes he would catch them doing something embarrassing, like falling over or dropping something important. Every time he would chuckle in a tone that implied that he had something to do with it. He always talked a lot more fluently for a 6-year-old, even using words that I don't ever remember teaching him. At first, I used to think he had amazing teachers that pushed him to his highest potential. But now, I started thinking it might be something else. This paranoia reigned on me. Everything wrong around me, I would question if he was involved. I started getting skittish at the thought of doing something with potential danger. I acted like all luck was stacked against my favour. I started getting terrified of driving, as I would see near accidents more and more when with Christian. Each close swerve or near head-on collision, he'd just giggle, innocently passing it off as him enjoying the quick movements. I was called into my weekly meetings with his teacher. While reviewing his work and behaviour, the teacher would not stop scratching himself. When I looked closer, I noticed he was covered in many needle-sized red dots. Curious and not thinking, I blurted out in shock. He straight away assured me it wasn't contagious, that it was just bedbug bites. I couldn't help but wonder if my son had something to do with it. On the way home, Christian started conversation. For the first time since I started these meetings with his teacher, he started questioning me about what we talked about. I simply told him that I cared for him and I wanted to know how he was doing at school. I explained that we just looked through his work and that if anything came up, I took his side. He immediately pulled that apart by saying no other kid was going through this. I backtracked and said he was a special case, but the damage was already done, and his tone started to grow more authoritative while he started picking apart everything wrong with what I said. But suddenly, he stopped. His voice raised to a tone like an adult trying their best to sound like a kid, and failing, saying, "You'll never leave me, would you, Daddy?" I was taken aback at him calling me Daddy, something he never really did before. Thinking quickly, I recognized that I should answer as fast as possible to not arouse any unnecessary suspicion. "No, son," I responded. "You'll never give me away, would you, Daddy?" Wanting to cooperate out of fear of repercussion, I answered, "Of course not, son." "Just checking, Daddy." At this, all conversation ended, and the rest of the car ride was silent. That night, I was still freaked out. The events of the car played over and over in my head as I lined it up to everything else that had happened. I put on a movie to try relax and take my mind off things. But in the darkness, I started noticing a strange sound. At first, I thought there was something wrong with my DVD, but when I turned off my DVD player, trying to see if resetting it would fix the sound, it persisted. That's when the daunting realization hit me. It was coming from somewhere inside the house. I was frozen in time, trying my hardest to not move and pick up on what the sound was, without my own movements getting in the way. When I did eventually settle into the stillness long enough to focus on it, I soon regretted it. It sounded faintly, like whispering. I looked around in the darkness, trying to see where it was coming from. However, the more I focused in one area, the more I noticed little traces of movement. All this culminated in the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I didn't sleep well. The morning after, I tiredly picked up the mail. While I walked to the area where I dumped the important envelopes, something slipped out. On the floor dropped a small business card, very plain in design. I eyed the details, thinking it was just some spam estate agent's details or a fast food joint. But when I read the first few letters, I immediately knew who it was. The name was titled with Doctor, and I straight away knew it was the psychiatrist from before. I pocketed the card, just in case. Each day from then on, things just got worse. I started feeling more and more drained each day. I usually ran on a healthy 6 to 8 hours sleep, but when that stopped sufficing, I started going to bed a bit earlier each day. It was a struggle to stay awake before Christian fell asleep, and some nights I failed, simply passing out on the couch while a show played. These were the good nights though, as there were the nights where, no matter what, I couldn't sleep. During these nights, I would be plagued by the strange sounds and movements now lurking in my house in the dead of night. My face carried the baggage of ill health. My eyes were sinking into dark circles, a badge displaying my sleeping problems. My cheekbones protruded as I slowly lost my appetite. I was losing weight at a slow and steady pace. This would have been fine if I wasn't already at a healthy weight before the losses. It gave me an emaciated appearance. People started giving a wide berth when walking past me on the street. Other kids would stare, showing me this wasn't all in my head like I'd hoped. This was all happening while my son was still getting terrible feedback from school. The teacher seemed like he was tackling his own levels of crazy in his life. While having small talk, he told me of the gruesome way he found his pet, and I don't want to repeat the kind of things that were happening in his dreams. These personal torments would never be brought up to kick Christian out of school or anything, as these weren't school-related. Though we never verbally acknowledged it, we always silently felt this had something to do with my son. It wasn't just the teacher that was complaining. Parents would find me when picking up Christian from school, telling me rumors of the strange behaviors by my son only hinted at by their kids. Kids that would be happily talking to Christian while I heard the complaints. But now, with a new lens of context, I could see the fear in their smiles as they spoke to him. I would be too lethargic to fight back, choosing to just listen. But there was one common theme. He'd never get caught. No matter what, he would always have the power of deniability on his side, meaning the teachers could do nothing about it. However, that never stopped the hateful remarks I'd hear in passing about my son and I. When in my lowest mental states, I'd sit in a quiet room and stare at the business card, which signified the potential biggest betrayal of my life. One number would mean I'd lose the last remnant of my family, the destruction of my wife's last memory. It was one of these tired, haggard states that I hit a breaking point. Despite all the stress, I still put my all into raising my son well. I spent hours poring over a nice meal to share with him. Some garlic and rosemary potatoes, mixed vegetables, and a honey roast ham. Everything was cooked perfectly, and because of this, I expected everything to go smoothly. But they didn't. Usually kids ate around their veg, but for some reason, Christian didn't take a liking to the potatoes. I was eating them fine, meaning there was nothing wrong with the taste. I remarked that he had to finish them before he could have dessert. It was this demand that put him on the offensive. He nonchalantly told me he was full, then demanded dessert. My response? I simply ignored him. I felt he was getting satisfaction from my squirming, so I decided that giving him no reaction would no longer feed his temperament. I was right, in a way. It was while I was looking down at my plate, trying to get the perfect mix of food, when a chunk of potato whapped off my face. Despite the soft texture, it stunned me for a second. The force provided was something out of this world. I snapped my head up in a red-hot rage and rhetorically shouted, "Did you throw that?" knowing I already knew the answer. What made me furious was that he had the gall to deny it. I retorted that it had to have been him, but he stood his ground and devilishly told me no. At this, I stormed over, picked him up, and forcefully carried him to his room. Despite his cheeky comebacks, he didn't put up a fight, most likely satisfied at his victory over getting me to so quickly lose my composure. I locked him in there, telling him it was for his own good and to think about what he did. Though he never took any reaction to punishments anymore, so it always felt like a waste of time. However, something bothered me. Before I closed the door, I gave him a look over to see if he snuck anything he shouldn't have before I locked him away. When I glimpsed his hands, they were completely clean. No sign of potato or gravy anywhere. Thoughts of strange possibilities briefly sent a chill down my back. In a shaken mindset, I went downstairs and impulsively called the number I had hidden away in an emergency spot near the phone. I muttered to the voice on the other end that I was thinking of taking up the offer, which I led to asking them to come over to help, and hung up. In my head, I felt like I only hinted at taking the offer in order to get them to quickly arrive to help. At the forefront of my mind, I still dearly loved my son, but in the back of my head, the offer warmed up significantly over this long period of torture. So if I took the offer, it would be for his own good, not my own. In that moment, I suddenly felt a sting of hindsight at how they confidently put the offer forward as a favor. I took this time to go to my room and sit on my bed to think. My room was a sanctuary to me, somewhere that my son rarely bothered me, either out of respect or a strange conditioning on his part to control where I stayed. It was because of that feeling of complacency that it shocked me when I heard a strange noise, a gentle rapping on the door. Confused, I asked who it was. The response left me even more confused. It was my son. The door opened and my son stood before the line separating my room to the hallway. He stared at me for a moment with furrowed brows. The air was thick with anticipation, creating a tense atmosphere, one that could only be broken by its creator. After a brief internal contemplation, Christian piped up. "Who was that?" "Who was what?" I shot back, deep down knowing what he was possibly referring to, yet relenting to reveal my plans. "Were you going to give me to them?" he asked, completely ignoring my denial. "I don't know what you're talking about." Not the best defense, but playing dumb was the best move that came to me fast enough to not rouse any more suspicion. "I saw the card by the phone," he said in a dull tone. "Oh," I thought to myself. My heart rapidly bounced around, spinning my head in a rush of panic. But this brought something to my mind which came to the forefront of my words. "Christian, how did you get out of your room?" This took him back for a second. I could tell he was preparing more for the conversation he started, not this. He stared at me menacingly. I could tell he was both thinking of what to say and what to do. And what terrified me was that to him, the possibilities were endless. During this silence, a sound cut through the air. The doorbell. That was fast, I thought. Some part of me tried not to think that they were that obsessed with Christian as to wait around constantly for the inevitable call. I put on my best poker face, got up, and told my son in an authoritative voice that I needed to get the door. A facade I kept up as I walked up to the door, which Christian slammed shut with an angry expression on his face. I smacked my palm hard and yelled at him, but when I tried the knob, I could only rattle it, appearing that the door was locked. The problem with this was that my door had no lock. I tried getting the door open, light at first, scared I'd hurt his little hands if I tried too hard. However, when it refused to even budge at any amount of effort, I resorted to yelling at him to open the door. The doorbell rang out more while I heard a quiet response from Christian, an ominous message that he was going to deal with it. After, I heard, "I'll be right there," shouted in a friendly tone. What worried me most was that he sounded vaguely like me. All I could do was wait, and while waiting, I heard muffled voices exchanging below between someone in the house and someone outside, to which I heard the door open. I pressed my head to the ground to get a better picture of what was going on. From what I heard, a man walked into the front living room and called out for me, to which he proceeded to the stairs. I followed the thumps to the front of my bedroom door and expected him to struggle to get in. However, the door just breezed open, and there he was, the man I wanted to save me. I quickly shot up from the ground, feeling relieved by his presence. He had a confident look on his face and told me he followed my instructions and came to my room. My instructions? I straight away knew something was up. Terrified, I tried to explain all I knew, but before I could get a few lines in, a look of shock wiped across his face. His breathing picked up, and he quickly span towards the door. He didn't make it close enough to brush the doorknob before he fell. He barely rolled to his back, his twitching making any kind of mobility difficult. It looked like he was having a stroke. His breathing switched from panicked to staggered. Colour drained from his face as his intake of air was shortening with each gasp. I rushed over and tried to rotate him to a better breathing position. I knew the only way he was going to breathe efficiently was with assistance. But just as I leaned in to give CPR, I jolted back in fear. Thousands of dots poured from his mouth and scattered away. One rolled past me, which I pressed with my thumbnail and picked up. When looking at it inches from my eye, I could see it was an almost microscopic bug. As they drained out of him, I could see the man's normal, healthy frame deteriorate at a disturbing pace until all that remained were his clothes and a few morsels of dried flesh. The bugs somehow disappeared as fast as they came. I got up and bashed on the door as hard as I could, not even needing to test the knob to know it was locked. I yelled and pleaded through tearful shouts. When I quietened down, I heard my son. All he said in a mocking tone was a callback that this was for my own good. I stayed silent, in complete disbelief at the situation. I had no way of bargaining. I was his. In my passive state, the door eased open, and at the entrance stood Christian, not looking fazed at all by the situation, "I think it's time for dessert, don't you?" he said in a calm tone. That was it. That was what this was all about. I strongly believe this wasn't a message about how I tried to transfer ownership of him, when in the end, he just wanted pudding. I didn't know how to respond. "Daddy, it's probably getting cold," he said in a more authoritative tone than I could ever muster, something which triggered fear in my heart. Fear woke me from my daze as I quickly snapped to attention and rushed to the kitchen. All I could think about while serving him a healthy portion was that, in reality, there was no way I could ever sell him, because he didn't belong to me. I belong to him.